We're on.
Morning and welcome to the House Environment and Energy Committee. This morning, we're going to continue taking testimony on H687 and welcome Jamie Fidel from VNRC.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back. Jamie Fidel, Forest and Wildlife Program Director and General Counsel with Vermont Natural Resources Council. I also help to coordinate the Forest Partnership, which is a group of conservation organizations that work on forest policy to help inform the legislature. And so part of my testimony today is informed by that group's input, and that's Vermont Land Trust and the Vermont chapter of the Nature Conservancy, Audubon, Vermont Trust for Public Land, Vermont Conservation Voters, and VNRC. And collectively, the Forest Partnership has been advocating for and supporting attention to addressing forest fragmentation and activity for a number of years now. And as part of our legislative platform for the year and what's in the common agenda from the environmental community is support for comprehensive reform of Act 250. You know, the work that you're doing, looking both at tier one, but then importantly, as we talk about tier two and tier three today, what we can do to try and maintain the overall viability, health, and functions of forest in Vermont and important natural resources. So I'm going to testify on behalf of VNRC, but I just wanted to let you know that that block of conservation groups supports adding forest fragmentation criteria to tier three and having jurisdictional approaches to address forest fragmentation and a heightened level of review for our most sensitive resources in Vermont. Understanding there's still some devil in the detail, but at a high level, all those organizations support the attention you're paying to tier two and tier three right now. So with that, I'll transition to just providing some testimony on behalf of VNRC. And it was, you know, you've had some great testimony this week. There's been some providing some background on the issue, you know, the importance of why we need to address forest fragmentation. And I think you've heard too that, you know, people who have been involved working on this issue for a long time, including folks at the Agency of Natural Resources, have been, you know, trying their best to address it, but that there are real gaps in Act 250. I mean, I think Sabina Haskell did a nice job essentially laying out that we don't really have a functioning forest criteria in Act 250, and that's been our concern for a long time now. The House has actually passed legislation to address forest fragmentation. I've lost count. I can give you three examples. H233, which Chair Sheldon helped to champion many years ago, did pass the House. I believe that was back in 2017, and that added forest fragmentation criteria. There's similarities to what's in 687 to that approach. There was S234 from a couple of years ago, which was the House's very comprehensive reform of Act 250 at the time, and COVID hit, and it didn't fully get across the finish line in the Senate, but a forest fragmentation criteria was supported by the Senate. That passed out and was sent to the governor, and it didn't become law. And I think there's other legislation last year that was on a similar path with the Home Act that had it as well, and the House and Senate both passed that. So there's been at least three times the House has acted definitively on this issue. There were some differences in the approach of H233 and S234. We are part of some work to sort of continue to work on the forest fragmentation criteria and build support for it. You know, both with the Agency of Natural Resources, stakeholders like Warren Coleman, representing folks from the development community, and others. And so we kind of, you know, we do believe that there was a good body of work there. I think there's important questions that are in front of you. How do we have a functional criteria? What are the details that are needed? What's the role of rulemaking in order to clarify certain things? What, you know, should be laid out with more clarity, not necessarily deferred to for rulemaking. And you know, in my opinion, where's there a role that rulemaking can play in order to clarify important terms, mitigation concepts, and those sorts of things. So at a very high level, I think it's really important to have the forest fragmentation criteria. We desperately need it. We don't have, again, a functioning criteria in Act 250 right now for forest, and that's sort of hard to believe because of the attention that Act 250 has to so many important resources, forest being 74% of our landscape, and the importance of forest within Vermont conservation design. You know, we have to have a functioning criteria. to have good site design in forests. And I think people have been really good in testimony. I've heard that what we're talking about is a heightened level of review, if you will. It's not, I haven't seen any criteria that has said you can't develop in forests. There may be some areas that aren't actually, shouldn't be developed in if we could, if we can really drive good land use planning. But at the heart of the forest fragmentation criteria is, I think, to create incentives for good site design and to have a functioning criteria then to, in our opinion, we think the right standard would be not have an undue adverse effect on forest blocks and habitat connectors. And the way that you would address that would be to avoid, minimize, and mitigate where appropriate. And I agree with Eric Sorensen. And I think I heard it from the Agency of Natural Resources yesterday. It's not appropriate to mitigate in every area. If we just go to a default mitigation policy, we're just going to continue to fragment our forest and offset it somewhere, but we're going to continue to have some really detrimental impacts. And I'm actually going to show you some visuals, some GIS work that we've done that highlights that in a minute. But mitigation may be appropriate in certain circumstances. And so, our work in looking at this over the years has been to, have a rulemaking to flesh out the appropriate circumstances where mitigation would be allowed and where it shouldn't be allowed, and where you really need to minimize through good site design and demonstrate first that you've tried that and you've done it. And that, I think, in listening to the agency and knowing their work, that's what they do a lot with projects with other criteria, is they work with applicants to shape it so that we're minimizing the natural resource impacts. And I just hope this can be the year that we finally have a criteria that allows for that. I think the statistics that we've shown and many others have highlighted, including John Adams and Randy from the Forest Service the other day, and there's other work going on in Vermont, continue to highlight that we're still lucky in Vermont. We still have a lot of intact forests, but the trends are problematic. They're noticeable. They're happening at a fairly fast clip. We're losing the extent of our intact forests and connectivity areas in an undeveloped status at a fast rate. And as we continue to develop in forests, I hope we can have a thoughtful approach on how we do that. So I am going to, as a next step, because I've been sort of focused on a lot of the GIS work that I wanted to share with you in a couple minutes, have not gone through like a markup of 687 and the forest fragmentation language itself. And I would be glad to do that, follow up with short order. I'm just going to stay at a high level now for supporting sort of what the principles that you're playing ball with in 687. And as I think we remember the NRB stakeholder process. And so we do support a road rule. That was part of the work that happened as part of that group. Now, there have been a number of jurisdictional options that have been considered through the years, and the House has passed a road rule through some of the legislation and S234 and others, and that was a 2,000-foot cumulative road rule. I think the utility of that approach was that we addressed the loophole that used to exist in the road rule. So it used to be an 800-foot road rule. It was eliminated when there was attention to dealing with, I think, spaghetti lots and some issues that were going on with stormwater. And I think that I've been meaning to go back and sort of research why we lost the road rule and what were sort of the judgments at that time to get rid of it. I think folks felt like there were too many loopholes. Maybe it wasn't working right, but instead of improving it, we let it go. And in hindsight, we lost the one jurisdictional approach in Act 250 that actually address shaping development in our forests. We were left to the lot size. And as I think our research shows, the lot size that's happening is not really triggering Act 250. So you could certainly look at, do you lower the lots? Do you have what's in 687 right now, sort of like you're developing a certain distance from a road? Do you have then automatic jurisdiction? Do you have a road rule? There's been a number of different examples of how to do this over the years, and we've been interested in examining all of them. What I can share is I think the reason that the road rule got consensus in the stakeholder group is folks from the housing and development community like the fact that if you do good site design, you don't automatically get triggered in Act 250. You can cluster your development and you're not going to trigger Act 250. And if you're let's say an individual and you really need to have a house that's, thousands of feet long up into the heart of a forest block, then that person can go through the heightened review. I want to add one important caveat, and I'm not sure this came through in the NRB report, but we advocated strongly for the language to highlight this. Our group did discuss the fact that the road rule at 2,000 feet was effective in addressing roads and driveways. Again, the old road rule just used to look at an individual road, and then you could punch a bunch of driveways off that, and that was a loophole. 2,000 feet, I think there was consensus. That's effective, especially if you're going to have a subdivision with multiple roads and driveways. But as you've been hearing, a 2,000-foot individual road is a long distance. I'm going to highlight some examples in a minute. And during the stakeholder process, we said we were really concerned about this. We thought there needed to be a single road trigger. And what the group said was, there's going to be different ideas on this. We have consensus on the 2,000 feet. We think the legislature, this is an idea that we understand has enough merit that the legislature will discuss it or should discuss it. That was our understanding of how the NRB report was supposed to come out on this. So it wasn't to say that there's not merit to look at a single road, just the group didn't have time juggling a lot of issues or was not going to come to consensus on what the recommended length would be. Some groups would continue, I think, to stand behind the 2,000 feet because that's where we could get consensus. And I think there was a recognition that groups like VNRC would be here advocating for a shorter single road trigger, which we think should be 800 feet. That's what the old road rule used to be. And I'm going to give you some examples in a minute that I think really highlight why that would be a good approach. 800 feet for single road, have the 2,000 feet then if you have cumulative roads and driveways. And I really hope that we can continue to do work, as Billy said, with the stakeholder group to find some consensus on this. Because I think we need to, at the end of the day, the NRB report, this is the one jurisdictional idea for all of tier 2. So if it's not functional and it doesn't work, we're not going to do anything to change the pattern in tier 2. So we're putting a lot of stock in supporting a functional road rule that will work. And then on tier 3, I think the concept that the NRB group got to, and I think it was great that there was consensus on a tier 3, is that we do have sensitive. Sorry, would you like me to pause?
Finish.
Okay. We do have important sensitive natural resources that should be identified through a planning and mapping process. That would have a heightened level of review through Act 250. How to do that, obviously, it's going to take some time. It should happen at the same level of importance as the tier 1 work. The RPCs and the fact that they're doing this planning initiative with the future land use maps, there's going to be a hard look then at from a mapping perspective of where there are areas that should be oriented towards conservation and other areas that should be oriented towards high density and growth and areas in between. When I think of tier 3, I think there could be the options both to include sensitive natural resources and important working lands too. The agency absolutely should play a key role, consultation role. I think there was some, question of what do they do? Do they drive this, or is the RPCs, think of the NRB process we envisioned, having a designation process for these areas, allowing the RPCs to sort of sponsor and drive that designation process, but have very strong consultation with the agency who does the mapping on a lot of these resources. But as was mentioned, I think there's other data sets, there's local inventories that towns do that should be fed in to the regional process. Regional planning commissions have done their own GIS work. So working in consultation with each other would be a good approach. And I could list a number of important resources that I think should be considered in tier 3. Right now there's I'm sure subsets of forest blocks, highest priority forest block areas, a Shutesville Hill corridor that's such a high priority connectivity area.
Slowly.
Okay.
First time.
So I would say that our intention is not to say all forest blocks or habitat connectors are included, but a subset should be considered. The highest priority areas, the ones that are critical for our landscape functionality. There's going to be certain types of critical wildlife habitat that are mapped, that are not covered under what's considered to be, maybe necessary wildlife habitat right now, or, rare, threatened, endangered species that can be mapped where the habitat is mapped. I think underwater resources, it's there's sort of this discussion happening of, what should maybe fall under an A&R permitting regime, like riparian corridors, for example, work that both the House and the Senate, are interested in. So what features come in on the water side versus what could be handled under an A&R permitting or program, which would then allow for the rebuttable presumption that you've met compliance with those resources in Act 250, I think is an important question. But, as we've been thinking about this at VNRC, we do think that, headwaters in Tier 3 or Class A and B1 streams, would be examples of water resources that should be considered. And so our suggestion would be to list, not an exclusive list, but examples of important natural resources. I think Billy Coster offered a list yesterday too, and I was trying to quickly jot them down and didn't get it all. We put together the list of resources that would offer guidance and then allow for basically an understanding of then how will those be mapped and ultimately allowed to be designated through the process. But don't make the list so that it's only these resources, because I'm sure there'll be others that are important to consider. So I guess I'll pause there just as far as a high level. I think that the other thing I've heard that's in sort of been recommended, or was recommended in the NRB report, was something Charlie Hancock mentioned. This is a policy we have supported for forest processing that impacts prime agricultural soils. Right now, industrial parks, if you're in an industrial park, there's a 1-to-1 mitigation ratio. There's a higher ratio right now for forest processing, and we think it's a fair policy to say, why don't we lower the mitigation rate to 1-to-1 on par with industrial parks. Maintaining a functional forest landscape, part of that is looking at the viability of the working land component of the landscape. So we do think it makes sense to have a policy there that helps in that regard. And was it last year or 2 years ago, you did work on hours of operation in Act 250, and that moved forward. So you did help another issue that was important to the viability of working lands in Vermont. Just one other quick thought before I forget, and then I'll pause for a minute. There are, and this is what I'll do in the markup of the language on the forest fragmentation criteria, the road rule, but you've heard his concern. I think you have to have some kind of tolling mechanism in the road rule. You don't want to allow just a leapfrogging effect where somebody can build a road right underneath the threshold, come back a couple of years later and build the same length, and they continue to, that's the end of our forest blocks over time. And so I think you need to have a mechanism to, at a certain point, like if you do that, you're going to trigger. There's an additive, mechanism. And I think language that you did on the road rule before tried to get at that. I'm going to look really hard at that to make sure that that's well written, should you choose to endorse the road rule concept. So I think I'll pause there.
Representative Sibilia, do you have a question?
I have forgotten my question.
Representative Smith?
Thank you. The other day, I looked at the endangered species and endangered plants in Vermont, and there's a lot of them. I'm guessing between 500 and 1,000, and I could be off, but could natural resources or VNRC or Act 250 stop someone from wanting to build on a 25 or 50 acre parcel if there was one endangered species on that property that was of a concern?
I think it's a really good question, and I think the devil's in the detail. Where is the development sited? Is it going to, avoid or minimize the impacts to that? What's the impact to that species? And if there's a direct impact, then I don't think the forest fragmentation criteria would necessarily set in. I think you're going to trigger. There's a provision in the law right now that relates to rare and threatened species. To There's a host of other species though that are not, listed that way, but they're state significant species of greatest conservation need. And so I think the idea of the forest fragmentation criteria is we're doing something to maintain, the health of forests because it's so vital to so many species in Vermont, like having a good pattern of development there to maintain the functions and integrity of forests. For your question, I'm sure the Agency of Natural Resource would have a particular review of that and give the applicant feedback on whether the development can proceed as shaped or needs to be, modified.
Thank you. Thank you.
Representative Sakowitz.
You mentioned, and following up on Representative Smith's comments, threatened and endangered species in tier 3 and the mapping that might go along with that. And maybe you're not prepared to give us any more detail on that, but if you had other ideas about what that might look like and what the impacts might be, I would love to hear what your thoughts are.
I think there's a bit of a tricky issue there because I think there's a reluctance to always map the locations of these resources for good reason of trying to protect those resources from being discovered or impacted by humans. And so I think that there's some guarding of some at times, especially for very discrete or, where we only have a couple known populations and there's nobody there sort of guarding it like on our alpine tundra where you have, people that work for the Green Mountain Club, for example, up there helping to manage people to stay off, sensitive species that exists in that geographic area, for example. So how, what gets mapped, what's possible being mapped or what's appropriate to be mapped versus not, so I think at times you're going to have to rely back on certain criteria and let it go through the process, but where it can be identified, certainly I think could be appropriate. That's, I think, what tier 3 is thinking about. What's our most important sensitive resources? So if that helps, but I'm definitely going to be giving this more thought.
You talked about the 2,000-foot rule for roads and various sort of permutations of that. And you mentioned that in the bill right now is a different approach, but didn't really talk about sort of contrasting them. I was just wondering what your take is on one or the other and
Sure.
how they might work better or worse in different situations.
Sure. I think that'd be best by sharing then some GIS work that I shared with Will this morning, and I was going to walk through if there's time.
Yeah.
Because that's the best way we've been looking sort of objectively at these different options. Should I do that now?
Sure.
Okay. I've got two different GIS sort of exercises we've been doing, looking at the road rule and then comparing it to what's in 687, just trying to get our head around this, right? And what's the right, how would a road rule be functional? So here are some examples on just road distances if we're looking at the road rule concept. So this is an example in Eden where there's no subdivision or zoning regulations. So there's nothing reviewing this kind of development at all. No Act 250 for this kind of road and no local review. And as you can see in the road I've highlighted here, I only went to where I could see a house, but then I don't know if there's a clearing beyond that, up higher here. In that next clearing, certainly if there's not a house there, could see it happening over time. This road is 2,759, at least to the house site that I located, going directly up into this, very intact forest block. And then the road continues to that clearing. And then I think what I see are maybe forestry roads coming off of that. So I don't know if this started as a forestry road. I think with the road rule, it's really important to clarify that if you're going to upgrade a forestry road and use it for development, then that should trigger Act 250. But if it's just forestry, it shouldn't. So this is just one example in Eden.
Representative Stebbins and then Bond Burns.
Thanks, Madam Chair. So I'm sorry, I don't know what this is an example of. This is an existing house, you're saying,
This is an existing house at the terminal that I've shown here with the dots. And then the road continues and goes to another clearing. And I couldn't locate a house there. I'm not sure if there is one or not. If there isn't one, I think there could be at some point.
but so this is an example of what is currently happening or
Is an
what
example.
would happen if,
This is a current example of existing forest fragmentation in a very intact forest block that had no review at all from a regulatory perspective. No shaping of the design. Because there's no local regulations and there's nothing in Act 250 that would review this.
okay, I'm just clarifying because it says example of road rule and I read this as an example of not having a road rule.
Thank you. It's just sort of my title to say, let's discuss
Okay.
forest fragmentation and the road rule concept, and I'll
Okay.
provide some examples.
How would, so if the road's over 2,000 feet, the house isn't built yet, how would citing that house differently affect this in any way?
If you had a criteria or and a trigger, you mean? Good question. I mean,
One house at the end of a 2,000-foot road, what are going to change?
well, so I guess, that person I think would have to go in and articulate why this is the chosen location. Have they avoided mitigation? Have they minimized mitigation in this case? Are there other viable locations? I mean, you can see the development that's happening off the road in other places is much closer to the existing road. And so I would envision the fragmentation criteria would work to encourage this person to, if this was a new road that's being built, develop their house closer where there's less impacts. And if there's some reason the house has to go this high up into the forest block, articulate those reasons, show and then there's a judgment, right? Is this an undue adverse effect or not? And so there would have to be, a weighing of evidence on that point and good, professional judgment from the agency or experts on this issue. So my hope would be that if there's a road rule, it would be an incentive for this person maybe to think about not having placed it there in the first place and not triggering Act 250. But if they really, really want it to go in this location, then highlight why. And
Representative Butler. Representative Torrey.
Jamie, I kind of got the impression from the A&R testimony yesterday that like a single house doesn't have that big an impact, but I could have been reading that wrong. What's your thought about what kind of impact this scenario would have on wildlife? And
I don't want to speak for the agency, but I believe that they would say that a single road can have a radiating impact. I know Eric said that, and he's been a longstanding voice of sort of input both at the agency and now outside of the agency. And I've heard him testify in the past on behalf of the agency, flagging
yeah,
that.
it wasn't Eric, it was the A&R.
I think it would be great to ask them to clarify that.
Yeah.
I don't want to speak for them. I think that, during the NRB discussions, I think again, I didn't hear folks saying that this idea of a single road trigger doesn't have merit. If folks felt like 2,000 feet is where we should land, then, but I didn't hear anybody say we should just allow single family homes to do this without any review. I think the question is,
And you feel confident that the undue adverse impact as A&R would do it or interpret that would be informed by all of the Vermont conservation design and things we've been hearing about.
that, yeah, right, the importance of the area
Yeah.
and the land use or design approaches that have gone into it. And then the considerations of how do you avoid and minimize? I think that there could be through, the guidance or rulemaking, for example, really good work done to actually articulate how you design things by following existing utilities, working in areas that are disturbed, clustering. There's a whole suite of best management practices that could be included in there. It's interesting because I heard Eric say, the agency has relied on kind of case law precedent to kind of refine some of these approaches over time, like how does the rare and irreplaceable natural area criterion work? And that can be one where it's a little bit harder because, you know, what those areas are sometimes need to evolve over time versus just having a static, let's say, rule that clarifies it. I think when it comes to the forest fragmentation criterion, you know, there is utility to actually providing guidance right up front. These are the best management practices you can follow as an applicant. So there's the clarity for an applicant or a developer. This is how you do good site design. And that would be really helpful up front versus waiting for case law or something in the future to further refine that. At times it will be refined, I'm sure. We'll learn about how to make this function better. Should it become law, but start somewhere by providing some good guidance. I also want to share that we, you know, for years, because we've been so concerned about forest fragmentation, have actually done mock subdivision exercises with real estate agents and engineers in the state. You know, we get together and we've held webinars on these issues. And I've talked to a number of engineers who have told me this is how they do. This is how they recommend and design good subdivision in Vermont. You know, there's a real cost to building roads like this and maintaining roads. And, you know, for many homeowners, they don't want to be saddled with that cost. I think and so there's already, I think, a lot of attention about how to do this well. It's not like, I don't think this would be forcing something on the engineering and sort of housing community to figure this out, you know, anew. But having good clarity, you know, in a rule, I think would be helpful, or in the statute. All right, I'm going to provide some other examples here, just to keep on moving.
Just one,
Yeah, Representative Morris and then Smith.
okay, thank you, Madam Chair. Jamie, a good example here, and from what I'm hearing from what you're saying is there's nothing, with no regulation, there's nothing to prevent this road from extending another 2,700, 3,000 feet up to that other field. And there's nothing to prevent parallel roads adjacent to this from being developed or put in.
But okay, unless I'm missing something, I haven't gone to look at Eden, but if there's no zoning. So first I would look, is there subdivision regulation so that as this continues to get subdivided into more lots, if this is one parcel, is there something to do good subdivision design there? And there's, I think, roughly 45% of towns. Get this right. It's either 45% or 55% have them. Maybe 45%. 20% of towns don't have zoning or subdivision regulations. So Eden's one of those towns. And so if there's no zoning, and usually single family homes, actually, even when there is zoning and subdivision regulation, there's usually, you know, by right, I think you can develop a single family, you know, home. And that would be a better question for land use planner. But I think that's my understanding. So to answer your question, I'm not aware of what, from a regulatory perspective, would prohibit that from happening.
But it could if there wasn't any. And if we wanted to protect this, some regulations would be required.
Some regulations would be required. And again, I don't think you'd be saying that it couldn't happen, but let's review it. Let's try and shape it in a proactive way. Let's work with this landowner to see what options exist and really take a hard look. If this is what we want, is to be promoting, or can we create some incentives too? Yeah, not to do this.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go along pretty much with something that Representative Mark was saying. Someone owns a piece of property that's 1,500 feet of right of way to get to. And they decide they want to build a house on that property that's 1,000 feet back into their own property.
Mhm.
You got two property owners involved to build a 2,500 foot road. Is that going to still be something that's going to be considered in the 2,000 foot road, or is it going to be 1,000 foot road and a 1,500 foot road?
So if it just went, if you just
You
went,
know what I mean?
I think so. If you just went with the 2,000 foot road rule, as you passed a couple of years ago, and so that's 234, then you would add up the individual roads that are going to be new. And if it goes above 2,000 feet in length or distance, then you would be reviewed.
So the number of property owners wouldn't matter.
The number of roads or driveways that would be created. Now, if there's, well, yeah, I guess to your point though, if there's different landowners, how you address this, I think it runs with the parcel. And so you could have this happening on one parcel and then another landowner doing it on their own parcel. That's the spaghetti lot, maybe kind of concept. If they're working in partnership though,
Well, if there, I guess, maybe I'm not explaining it right, but someone owns a piece of property that you've got to, say, a landlocked piece of property behind it.
Okay,
And the person that owns the property sells you the right of way, but there's already, a road into his property and you need to build a 1,500-foot road.
okay.
Are you gonna be under the 2,000-foot road when you attach to that piece of road that's already existing?
So this, I think, highlights why getting the language right is important. So if you
Exactly.
look at the language and say, are we adding existing road? It's just strictly new road? So you start at the point where a new road would be created for that access. Under Vermont land use statutes, people have a right to access in Vermont. If you have a landlocked parcel, you do have the right to access that. So that you can access it. The question would be then, is it long enough to have environmental review? And those details are important, I think, to work out.
That's something to consider, I think.
Yeah.
On that, I've got to go.
I'm going to move on to another example. This is in Waitsfield. Now, maybe I was trying to fix this morning, but you have the circles, but actually then there's a line that continues up to the location close to where our house is. The house is actually to the south of where that line continues. I just wanted to highlight that that's 2,000 feet, and then the house is a bit beyond that. I also wanted to highlight where 2,000 feet gets you, right, sort of into the heart of this intact forest block in Waitsfield, which is my hometown. So it's just another, this did not trigger, obviously didn't trigger Act 250. Waitsfield has improved their regulations to have some look at forest fragmentation. And I'd have to go back to understand if this happened before that, or this actually happened even with it. So I think there's examples where we could ask, well, don't we have local regulations? There's a whole range of local regulations and how strong they are. We've done other research on this. I think you were asking about this the other day. I'd be glad to share that report with you. I can say right now with confidence that it's a real range. I don't think we could just sit here comfortably and say local regulations have got this issue. This really does need to be a backstop in Act 250. Here's another example in Warren. Again, I didn't even go to the whole house to show you where you get to with 2,000 feet. The house is down here. I think that lot, another clearing up there, which I couldn't tell if it has a house, but it definitely probably will. House is down here, but get to 2,000 feet. And this is the Northfield Range, very intact, forested community, important forest block in the Mad River Valley. And this is going up much further than existing development and leapfrogging off of what was previous development there. A couple other examples in orange. This is 3,500 feet long. Roxbury. So this is a road. I don't think it's a private, well, this is Shaw Road. I don't know if that's a private road. Did have volunteer help with creating some examples just to give you visuals here. But what's interesting to me is look at the pattern of development all around the road, and then you have this road, and I don't know how many houses are off it. It doesn't seem like that many. So you've got development happening much further, closer to the road, and then maybe one or two, maybe a couple more. I'd have to really get into the details there, up further. And here's Granville, 1,600 feet, so this wouldn't get triggered, under the 2,000-foot standard. So those are just some examples to give you visuals of the amount of roads that, could be built. And I think in our opinion, why it's really important to have a single road consideration that's at a distance that will do something to incentivize development closer to where the existing lots usually are happening, and then heighten review. So then we did some GIS analysis on another option, which is in 687, which is you would have, if I'm reading 687 right, you if you're developing 500 feet off of a state or town highway, not a private road or class 4 road, then if you're developing into those areas, you would then be under Act 250 review. And so what we did, and I'm sure there's different ways to improve this GIS analysis, but we looked at a number of towns. We didn't know what the data would show us to begin with, so it wasn't like we were trying to, cook this in a way to influence you, but just to objectively look at some options for this. Started in my hometown of Waitsfield. So what this tells you is the total acreage in the town, how many acres are sort of beyond that 500-foot state or town highway, the amount of acreage that would be within the 500-foot, which is really 1,000-foot sort of buffer, if you will, if that's what we want to call it, the area beyond it. And then the green is forest blocks because we're interested in sort of impacts to forest. It doesn't mean that there's not forest within the white areas. It just means that I don't think that they're mapped as forest blocks. And I'd have to go back and check that. I want to make sure that the person that helped me with this got all the forest blocks versus just a subset. This is as far as we were able to get to this week, and we'll continue to refine this as it's helpful.
Amy,
Yes.
I want to, because we talked about this the other day.
Yeah.
I think it's important to realize some of that is going to be valuable farmland.
Farmland, and so
And I think remembering that white doesn't mean nothing's happening there. It means that, there's other fragmentation that we're concerned with.
exactly. And there's things we'd like to do to improve this, other features we'd like to show. We kind of have a list based on the capacity of the volunteer we've been working with, what we could get done for purposes today and what we'd like to continue to look at. Adding ag lands would be important because if you have a forest fragmentation criteria, it's important to consider how we're fragmenting prime agricultural land too. And then we did add the total E1911, E911 points that fall within that buffer and what would fall outside. And what I think is interesting is you do see some examples here of where there's been subdivisions and houses that are outside of the buffer because they're on private roads. It's not maybe the best color here, it's in pink, but if you look at your own version on your computer, hopefully they show up. So for example, this road here, I think that's the Howe Block, that's in state ownership. This is the Northfield Range, which is not under public ownership. And I think this highlights too, as we look at these different examples, like if we think about, a road rule or this, to keep in mind that if we're leapfrogging off of roads, then we wanted to show all the roads that potentially would be in play. Or if you look at the buffer concept, how it works. Interestingly, my house is included in an area that would potentially fall under Act 250 jurisdiction. I have my house, so I think the bill contemplates if I do something to improve the residential nature of that, I'm not under Act 250. But if a lot was developed next to me, and there's still lots available on our road, they would be under Act 250. And so, as we're looking at this objectively, I do think that's one, fair point is, do we want to capture those areas under Act 250, or not? So I don't know if there's, a refinement there. If we decide to go with this concept of what to do with some of these more infill areas that are not in, critical resource areas or have a high density development already.
Can we go back to the southwest corner there that you said was state land and has a big private road through it with houses along it or buildings along?
Yep. I'm guessing maybe that existed before it became state ownership.
State ownership on both sides of that road?
Yeah, that's the Howe Block. That's where there's some mountain biking trails and something called the Enchanted Forest, which was an old CCC plantation of yeah. So you can see here, we did look at some, just so we could kind of understand what you have in your materials or other options about buffer lengths, just so we could understand sort of what it does. So I'm not going to run through all these. I know there's not time for that, but there's sort of 500, 800, 1,200 feet and 2,000 feet. And I think for us, why we wanted to really look at 2,000 feet is this helps us understand a little bit more of the road rule too. Okay, because now granted, a new road is not going to just go directly. Well, I gave you some examples of where it does kind of go directly right up to the top of a mountain. There'll be some switchbacks along the way, so this is not entirely accurate. my concern, if we go with a 2,000-foot single, is you now are gonna have to add 2,000 feet off these areas in order to trigger Act 250, and the private roads aren't even included in what is buffered here. So you have to envision that. And I'm not sure you're really doing anything then. Again, we stand behind the concept of what's in the NRB report as a road rule. That's where we think is good policy. It just, we think it needs to be refined for a single road.
Tori.
Question for you on the, were you on the working group? The NRB?
John Groveman was our designee, but I participated in many of the conversations, especially around tier 2 in this issue.
Okay, because I have a question, thinking about resilience and, you know, our wetter climate and our multiple mud seasons. I'm hearing from constituents who are feeling stranded in their homes because they're at the end of a long dirt road. Did resilience come up too in the discussion around the road rule? Because it seems like it's also has the positive of preventing a homeowner from getting themselves into a worse situation because of the placement of their home and the length of their road, that they're in fact going to have, you know, they can be stranded more often.
Mhm.
And I know in our community, when we were looking at stormwater runoff on a watershed level, we learned a lot about our private roads and how many of them we had, which was really kind of alarming to learn, and how important good road management is. And it's a lot harder to do when you're dealing with private owners. And there's a lot of education we've been trying to do in our community around stormwater management and trying to add capacity for homeowners who are on dirt roads and responsible for managing them. So I'm excited about the road rule for a lot of reasons, but one of them is the potential to prevent unsustainable bad road design.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing more and more why there's challenges with this, what this kind of development can pose, you know, erosion and sedimentation issues too, if the roads aren't designed well. And then, you know, challenges for landowners themselves. We also understand from our research that a lot of the markets driving this kind of development, this is desirable for people who are moving to Vermont, especially those who have the means to develop this way. I think Eric touched on that too. You know, our land values are going up for sure, but, you know, comparatively in other areas, there are attractive parcels, very hot, you know, real estate markets we've experienced. And so from our own perspective, we've looked at the road roll for those very issues, you know, in addition to habitat or forest integrity.
Mhm.
And I really want to give credit to the folks who participated in the stakeholder group. I feel like there was a lot of consensus around this because the people there, you know, whether it was Megan with the chamber or folks that were in the housing community, I think people really, at the end, I think the validation of this as an issue was genuine. And I think people really did want to do something, you know, how to get the right balance of a policy and a comprehensive package that can become law is, you know, I'm sure on people's minds, but I heard people talk about climate along the way. And I think we're thinking holistically here about these different considerations. I don't know how much you want me to go through all the examples that we have in here. There's 4 other towns and we're interested in doing more. I think they all kind of show similar trends as far as, you know, what this 500-foot concept does. You know, there's a lot of land that potentially would be applicable, you know, to it should development occur in those areas. You know, I think what highlighted something we've already said is what about, you know, areas that are not maybe in critical areas? Do you want, you know, would it capture sort of density that maybe you want to encourage? But I think I want to come back again to the point that, you know, the 2,000-foot maps are helpful too, as we look at the road roll concept as well. And so I guess I'll pause and just ask how much you want me to go through these. You have them in your materials now as a PDF, and I want to defer to you and your time management of what's most helpful.
Right, thank you for doing this. It's very helpful. I had, when we were talking about this bill off session, a quick look at two towns with the 500-foot idea in mind, and came up similar to the Waitsfield slide here where, 75% or 70 in Waitsfield, 71% of the existing development was within 500 feet of a town road. And I guess we stuck to town roads because it's select boards that make the commitment to managing those roads, and gets to some of what Representative Torrey was talking about. I would like to follow up on impacts to, well, town roads and private roads post all the storms we have had recently. And I think, yeah, I mean, the private road piece, I think your earlier examples show there's already a lot of private roads.
Mhm.
And to have a long road rule that just goes off them, I don't see how that's going to, you say it'll help cluster development. I don't know how it does that unless you pair it with some other requirement. And so, I mean, I think this is a challenge for us as policymakers, and I appreciate that you've given us a jump start on looking at the data. I also think it's super important when you're looking at those white spaces to consider prime ag soils.
Mhm.
And those, we have repeatedly been told in the forest fragmentation conversations that we can't use that no one wants to use the maps of forest or the conservation design maps for regulatory purposes, which fine, I understand some of the reasons there. But I think this idea of having a setback, it's worth talking about, it's worth exploring, and not necessarily linking it, because we've been asked not to link it in the past to mapped resources, frankly. So
Right.
I think it's a little you're conflating two things when you're doing that by saying we're not supposed to use them for regulatory purposes, and then using them to evaluate it.
We've been under the similar constraints in thinking about this, right? There's been a lack of desire to use them for regulatory purposes, but we very much want to know how these policies would impact these areas. And you're absolutely right. There are ag lands and other important natural resources that fall within these white areas. It's just the beginning of our exercise, and we hope we can continue to refine it to be helpful. And I do think, to your point that you were saying that, yeah, I mean, if you just go with the 2,000-foot road rule, not paired with anything else, I've suggested just a single road threshold of 800 feet, but I do think it's important for you to discuss that as you consider the road rule. And I think it's important for us to continue to work with the stakeholder group that Billy mentioned to see if we can get to better consensus about that, or do folks feel like that is really the best we can do with that concept.
And I'll just reiterate my concern that the private roads are in large part, there's a lot of them already built.
Right.
So to have a 2,000 feet off of a long private road that's already been built, we're moving really away from the goals of what we're trying to achieve. And increasingly, we're moving towards using public dollars to restore private roads and private driveways so that people don't get surrounded, because, your heart goes out to your neighbor when this happens, but how much of that, we can barely afford to keep the public roads open in some of our communities right now.
Yeah.
It is a taxpayer burden to have this type of development.
The one thing I would just quickly say is I think, all this is important dialogue. I really appreciate the way that committee's trying to thoughtfully think about the best approaches. In all my years of working on this issue, I've never found sort of this amount of consensus around addressing forest fragmentation, and that's great. Our desire is to work within that and hopefully have something that people can really get behind and can become law. And I think this conversation you're having about how do we do this well is super important.
Representative Pat.
Actually, I've been thinking the whole time about a wrinkle that I'm familiar with that actually kind of gets to what Representative Sheldon was just saying, which is an existing private road and then building off of there. In this case, this is directly opposite my house on a back road, and the existing private road was once upon a time a town road. That's how it was built, went all the way through the town line to Middlesex on the other side. And that was abandoned a very long time ago as a town road, but it was taken over by the property owner, who there are now probably about 8 houses on that private road. I know a number of the people. All of those houses are relatively close to that road. But what would happen if someone wanted to start extending longer distances off of what was originally built as a town road?
Right.
And I'm not asking for an answer now, but it's just I know of other situations like that around where a private road was a town road in the towns in my area, and I guess that could come up.
Yeah, I think that's where some of these maps help, because you start to visualize the placement of them, then, and then what happens.
Representative Stebbins.
Thanks. So probably Waitsfield is a good one to use because it's your town, so you might have like a anecdotal sense. But when I look at this, I'm like, hey, that's great. It looks like there's a fair amount of, opportunity for placing housing closer to roads rather than, farther away. That being said, there's also like so much of Vermont is, like a turn with like a steep hill that like if you were to try and build there, you'd have to like level it, which brings in all sorts of other considerations about stormwater erosion. Or I'm just thinking about the number of houses that have been like wedged into like the tiny little piece of like flat leveled space. So just your sense of like knowing your town, how much of that is really buildable versus sort of like those weird, precipitous drops or, something not that buildable.
But if you see couple of these homes here, it was done, and there's opportunity for more, and I don't, Waitsfield basically took, I think, 3 attempts, but now we have sort of a ridgeline zoning district for headwater protection. But it could happen. And I think, the one thing we don't want to encourage is somebody building a really bad road because they've got, a regulatory consideration in mind, like we want them to be developed well. So I mean, to your point, I think that there are opportunities for more development, in these areas that, going back, I think this is a better example maybe to illustrate what you're talking about. Because this is in Waitsfield, right along the Northfield Range and so, all the developments happen closer, but then you have these 2 here, and I'm not sure there's anything to prohibit more of that from happening.
That's not what I'm asking. What I'm
Okay.
asking is, a lot of our roads are, like, if I just think about going from Waitsfield to Waterbury, there are so many places along 100 that, really in my mind, I mean, unless you just like leveled the
Mhm.
property right next to the road, you can't really build there. So really my question was how much, it looks like there's a lot of building, potential there. But I guess maybe a future round for me personally, that would be helpful if you're going to keep working on this, is to get a better sense of, okay, what's actually like kind of flat and not just like,
Like topographical.
Yeah,
Development,
yeah.
feasibility.
yeah. If it's not to give you more homework, because I'm sure you have plenty, but it's helpful for me to then actually see, okay, it's right next to the road, that's 500 feet, but is it a drop down to a riverine or? Again, you don't have to do it.
There's
It's
a lot of
just,
this that we can do ourselves with the A&R Atlas. Like I have it open now, I just put the topo up and so
get a sense that
I
way.
I can do a demonstration of that at some point.
So I would be glad to follow up with suggestions on language as a next step, if that's helpful. I haven't had time to do that. I will certainly explore our ability work with our volunteer to see capacity to do more GIS work if that's helpful. And really appreciate your attention to, you know, the entirety of the NRB report and the legislation you have in front of you. And, you know, this moment in time, I think of some other folks have said, I think, you know, we've got a number of challenges we're addressing, from the housing crisis to climate and maintaining biodiversity. And I do think, you know, it was wise to ask for the studies that you did. It did, I think, develop in a lot of good work in bringing stakeholders together. And it's not the entirety of stakeholders that you need to hear from. But I do believe it's probably the most work that's ever been done to try and build a foundation for you. And I think this is a really important moment for us in the state. This is critical to address this comprehensively as you're discussing. So thank you.
Thank you for your testimony and for your work on the mapping for us. All right, members, we actually don't have any more witnesses until 1 this afternoon, so little space in your day. We will